Welcome to the Outlier Podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Conlin, and today we are diving into a tragic and unsolved case that has haunted a New Hampshire family for 4 years. This is the murder of 19-year-old Michael Mowry III. And I had originally said I wasn't going to do an episode for this Monday. I was taking some time off for the holiday, but I came across this story and I was like, oh my gosh, how did I not know about this? And this story is especially heartbreaking for a number of reasons. But there are not a lot of details available here. It's an open investigation, an unsolved case, and in the episode notes, I have information about who you can contact if you have any helpful info that will lead to an arrest. And there is now a reward. It's not a lot, but I guess it's better than no reward, but more on that later. But again, something that makes this case so heartbreaking is that Michael Mowry seemed like a wonderful kid, not into anything salacious at all. But let's say that he was, that doesn't mean he deserved to be murdered in cold blood. So let's get to the information that we do have about this case. It was the early hours of August 30th, 2020, Labor Day weekend, when the tranquility of a Rochester, New Hampshire neighborhood was completely shattered. And I grew up in New Hampshire, born and raised. Rochester is quiet. There's an opera house that's pretty well known in the town. There's lots of fall leaf peeping because it's so beautiful. Nothing crazy really happens there. It's a population of around 32,000 people, and it's about an hour and 20 minutes outside of Boston, Massachusetts. So at approximately 3 a.m., 4 masked men forced their way into the apartment on 64 Monroe Drive in Rochester. And that night, their target appeared to be Michael Mowry III, a 19-year-old who had recently moved into this apartment as his first apartment ever. He was full of dreams and aspirations, and what happened next would leave his family devastated and the entire community searching for answers. So Michael was found fatally shot in his bedroom. The cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the neck. Police arrived within minutes after a 911 call was made at 3 a.m., but it was too late. Now, I have no idea who made this 911 call. I would assume that it was one of his roommates. He had 2 roommates at the time, or hey, it could be a neighbor. And I actually reached out to the Attorney General's office when researching this case, the New Hampshire Attorney General's office, and they didn't respond yet, but this is an open investigation. The case is open. So police reports, 911 calls, they are not just readily available to the public if you send a FOIA request. And, well, it's in New Hampshire, so it's actually called the right to know request. But another complication, I guess, is that you have to be a New Hampshire resident to get all of this information. So it's a combination here, I believe, of why not a ton of information is available. But I would love to speak with Michael's mother just about some of this stuff. So let's see where this goes. But Michael loved sports. Like I said, he was a great kid. He loved baseball, and he had just started to build his life. He moved into his own apartment with 2 roommates, and they were said to be home at the time of the home invasion. And I want to point out, in a recent article from the Foster's Daily Democrat, Michael's mother said she keeps in touch with these roommates, but nowhere in the news or in any of the articles that I've read does it print their names. And the New Hampshire Attorney General once stated, quote, "Other young residents living in the apartment with Mowry have been interviewed, cooperative, and are not considered suspects by law enforcement," end quote. Okay, a little bit more about that in a bit. But first, let's talk a little bit more about Michael Amy Lucier, who was Michael's mother, remembers her son as a loving and generous young man, someone who cherished his family, especially his three younger brothers who really looked up to him. In her own words, she said, quote, "He was incredibly affectionate and gave the best hugs. When we told him we loved him, he always responded, 'I love you more.'" Michael's life was full of promise, and as I said, he had just moved into his Rochester apartment weeks before the murder, and he was so excited to just move on as an adult and take the next steps in his life. He had plans to continue his education at Great Bay Community College, and he was even in talks to play baseball on their team. His mom just remembers Michael being so happy and so excited about all of this. Now, investigators quickly determined that on that faithful Labor Day weekend of 2020, Michael's death was the result of a home invasion robbery. Okay, so nowhere in any of my research did I see that these men took something from the apartment. I don't know what they took and how investigators came to this conclusion and why they would shoot Michael. I would assume that he would be sleeping at 3 a.m., but we don't know that. I mean, he could have been up hanging out. He could have been up on his phone, watching TV, maybe playing a video game. Who knows? This information is not available. We don't know if he fought back, if he had defense wounds. I know absolutely nothing. So the four men who broke into the apartment were masked and managed to flee the scene immediately after the shooting. Okay, so how do we know that they are masked? Again, we don't know. Did one of the roommates see this? Did a neighbor see this? No idea. The New Hampshire Attorney General's office is currently asking the public for help to try to solve this killing, and they released new details on Monday, August 26th, 2024, about the four masked men. So now, as of 2024, investigators said they were able to identify the getaway car, but the owner of the vehicle is not a suspect. So, did these four men borrow the car? Did they steal a car? We don't know. Investigators also said they believe the men to have ties to the area of Haverhill, Massachusetts. And we don't know why they believe this because they haven't told us. But just to give you an idea about Haverhill, it's very industrial, but there's also some pretty ghetto areas as well with some heavy drug use. The population is about 67,000 people, and it's about 49 minutes away from Rochester, New Hampshire. So if they were in fact from Haverhill, Massachusetts, there was clearly a reason they drove all this way to Monroe Drive in Rochester. I mean, it's not close by, and it's 3 a.m. in the morning, so what the hell? Now, here's a quote from the Senior Assistant Attorney General, Ben Agati. Quote, "It is very rare in New Hampshire that we have a crime where we have individuals that are unknown to each other, completely unknown to each other. This is a situation that falls into one of those categories. It is one of the rare cases from 2020 where we did have an unsolved." End quote. Okay, but how did they come to this conclusion? I guess that's what I want to know. There seems to be all of these conclusions, right? Like, yes, it was a home invasion. Yes, they were masked. Well, how do we know that? How did they determine this if we don't know if anything's been stolen, if we don't know exactly what the quote unquote witnesses have said, if those witnesses are Michael's roommates, if they're the neighbors? We don't know what these people were into either. We don't know anything. So I think at this point, they're really looking for somebody that was possibly involved or who has a conscience to come forward and say, hey, I know what happened. I heard about this, and this is what they were going to do. So once again, I'll remind you, the roommates who live with Michael, they have been cooperative with the investigation, and yeah, they're not considered suspects. But for me, the question remains, who are these roommates? That's where my mind goes. And I'm sure most of the people that heard about this case, their heads probably went where my head went without having a lot of information. Did the perpetrators, did they shoot the wrong person? What were Michael's roommates into? I mean, I'm not trying to point any fingers. This is just the unknown. So Michael's mother obviously quoted that she is still in touch with them. So I do feel like we have to trust in the fact that law enforcement did look into them. And Michael's mother, she most likely has a gut feeling about people, especially, moms always have gut feelings when it comes to their children and who their children surrounds themselves with. And yeah, so I'm trusting in those points, right? Law enforcement did their job, and Michael's mother, her gut most likely tells her that these guys are good. Now, I did go down a few rabbit holes on Reddit trying to see if there were any names listed, any friends listed, nothing. And I also thought about the neighbors. Was Michael's home an accident? Were these four men supposed to go to the house across the street or next door? I did look up to see who lived around the area in the Monroe Drive area in 2020. And the residents I did find, I ran some background checks and no one had a criminal record. And that means nothing, but let's say they did have a criminal record, that would most likely be a signal for investigators to dig further. Just a side note, there did seem to be a lot of sex offenders in the vicinity. I'm not sure that's relevant, but if you do live in the Rochester area, just be aware. But just back to Michael's mother, Amy Lucier, she has become a tireless advocate for her son. She has spoken out so many times, and she just hopes that by sharing Michael's story, someone somewhere will come forward with information that could lead to an arrest. And she describes Michael as a really good kid who had hopes and dreams like any other teenager. He wasn't involved in drugs, and she does not believe that he had any enemies who would wish harm on him. To her, this crime seems entirely random, but she's very convinced that somewhere out there knows the truth. And I think that is what we always say. Someone knows something. Now, for Amy, the pain of losing Michael is completely compounded by the fact that 4 years later, she still has no answers. They have made no progress. And she said, quote, "This is always on my mind. We are healing as best we can, but until we know, there will be this hole, this empty place," end quote. And Michael's childhood, as Amy said, was filled with joy, adventure, and Amy actually homeschooled him in his early years, which gave the two of them this opportunity to bond over a number of activities that meant a lot to Amy and Michael. They loved to four-wheel together, they went dirt biking, and they would always visit any and every museum that they could find. They had a tight-knit group of friends and a passion for sports, as I said, particularly baseball. And Michael played for the Mavericks in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and he was a fixture in the senior Babe Ruth League. So he's just missed by so many people, and he was the kind of person who drew others in, known for his kindness and his love for life. So he actually attended Paul Elementary School in Wakefield, New Hampshire, and then graduated from Kingswood Regional High in Wolfboro after he was homeschooled. So then, after spending some time in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, which is kind of up in the Lakes region, it's really, really beautiful, he decided to go to Rochester. He said he had always loved it there. He had friends there, and he was going to go to school. So he and Amy stayed in touch. They were still very close. And the week before his death, Amy and Michael spent a ton of time together. They just ran errands and enjoyed each other's company. They talked about his future, his plans to continue his education, and how excited he was about the possibility of playing baseball again. There was zero sign that anything was wrong in his life. He didn't seem worried. He didn't tell her that he was having problems with any friends or involved in any drugs. And I know that that means nothing, but Amy continues to stand by the fact that she knows her son. They were close and he would have told her something. So since that night, Amy has just faced so many challenges. I mean, her youngest son had a seizure just 2 weeks after Michael's death, which seemed to be a result of the trauma and the confusion that came with his brother being murdered and just losing his brother so suddenly. And another one of her sons recently lost a close friend in a car accident, adding just another layer of grief to an already overwhelming situation for this family. But Amy remains steadfast in her pursuit of justice, not just for herself, but for her other sons and her entire family. Now, the investigation into Michael's murder remains active, with the New Hampshire AG's office continuing to seek leads. The authorities are working closely with law enforcement, both in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts, but they've said they need the public's help. A $1,000 reward is being offered for tips that lead to an arrest, and information can be reported anonymously by calling the Rochester CrimeLine or texting crimes with text for cash in the body of the message. Now, as we close today's episode, the plea from Michael's mother resonates so deeply. She has said, quote, "Please do the right thing and speak up. Our family is stuck here, not able to go forward. The hope is that somewhere, someone knows something and they can finally bring closure to a family that has been living with this unbearable loss for far too long." And now, as I've stated earlier in this episode, a lot of things are very unclear to me. I would like to know other details. I want to know who saw the men. I want to know how they figure it was a home invasion if nothing was taken, or what, if anything, was taken. I want to know who are the neighbors, who are the roommates, what were the relationships. A lot of unanswered questions, and I understand it might not be my place to know. However, if you were asking the public for help, I think as much information should be given to us that won't hinder the investigation. So hopefully, with this story just now making the news once again 4 years later on August 26th about the getaway car, maybe more information will be released in the weeks to come. Now, thank you for joining us today on the Outlier podcast. If you have any information that could help solve this case, go to the episode notes and look where to text. Please come forward. This was a young man with so much love to give and so much life to live for, and his family deserves answers. Until next time, stay safe and stay vigilant. I'm Lauren Conlin. Thanks for listening.